I'm David Suchet, and I'm on a journey around the Mediterranean, following in the footsteps of a man who 2,000 years ago traveled more than 10,000 miles around the Roman world by foot and many, many more by sea.
This is extraordinary. We must appear that size from up there.
For the last 25 years, I've been fascinated by St. Paul. To some, he's the man who did more than anyone else to transform Christianity from a small Jewish sect into the most powerful religion in the world. To others, he's a preacher of prejudices that have echoed down throughout history.
And they must have thought the arrogance of the man. Here he is, on the basis of one vision, so he says. He's telling everybody what
Changing
they should
all
do.
the rules.
A man of contrasts and confusions, a fanatical persecutor of Jesus' earliest followers, who once supported the stoning to death of early Christians, who then claimed to have experienced a miraculous conversion on the road to Damascus.
Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered.
A man convinced that the end of the world was coming and that he had a God-given mission to convert non-believers to Jesus.
You're just made of stone. Push you over and you'll break into hundreds of pieces.
If ever there was an historical character I've longed to play, it's Paul. So for me, this is a very personal quest.
I could look like that. What do you think? A little bit.
I'll be seeking out clues in the places he visited, deciphering new evidence from the latest archaeological research, and meeting expert witnesses from around the region to help me uncover this remarkable man hidden within the pages of the New Testament. My search for Paul has led me out of the Holy Land and through Roman Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. I've arrived just off the coast of Kavala, a major seaport in eastern Macedonia in northern Greece. In the 1st century AD, this was the main gateway to Philippi, a major garrison city of the Roman Empire.
And it was here that Paul first set foot on European soil. And by the time he'd reached here in around AD 50, he had already established small communities of believers in Asia Minor. But now he'd set his sights on the west, to lands where the name of Jesus was not known.
For Paul, this is a desperate race against time, to convert non-believers to Jesus before the end of the world arrives. But he's now moving closer to the heart of the Roman Empire, where Caesar himself is revered as a god. And he's carrying with him a radical new manifesto, preaching that all are equal, whatever their place in society, calling for love and understanding within communities, and demanding that pagan ways be swept away by a higher moral code. Surely Paul must have realized he was putting himself in grave danger. Attacking the Roman religion was attacking the Roman state. Once ashore, Paul's journey to Philippi would have taken him along the Via Egnatia, a major Roman road that ran through northern Greece. Incredibly, several long stretches of the road still exist today.
It really is the most extraordinary feeling to know that I'm actually walking on the same stones as St. Paul walked when he went to Philippi. And it's 15 kilometres and uphill most of the way.
This region was one of Rome's oldest and largest provinces. The heavy presence of empire surrounded Paul as he approached Philippi. He was definitely stepping out of his comfort zone. How would he be received in a city where the worship of pagan gods was woven into the very fabric of life? Where their images adorned not just temples, but workplaces, public arenas, and even people's homes? On the outskirts of Philippi, I met one of the city's modern guardians, Alexei Labranidis.
Alexei, hello.
Oh, hello.
David.
Welcome. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So this is Philippi.
This is Philippi. Let's see the city. We are entering the city from the city walls. They were combined with the theater.
What was it like in the first century here?
Very crowdy and full of life. It was a city between 10 and 15,000 people. And imagine that we had people from everywhere, not only Romans.
Yeah. What was the religion here?
It was a mixture. Everybody was believing his own faith.
Traces of pagan gods from all over the ancient world, from Greece, Babylon, and Egypt, had been found in Philippi. Alexei was keen to take me in search of new discoveries carved into the cliffs high above the city's amphitheater.
See what I can find. You go that way,
Yeah, you can.
and I'll go up there. Oh, look, up there. Looks like a hunting scene. It looks as if the hunter is throwing something.
It's like a big comic book on the rocks.
It does look like a big comic book. And a huge quarry, comic book quarry. Are there many of these all over?
All around you can.
Oh, look, there's
also,
another one in here. Oh, wow.
Here you can see Artemis with the bow and the dog. We had a society of hunters. They had dogs and they were believing Artemis, the goddess of the hunt.
Why are they here amongst these rocks?
People were mining here and were taking material to build the city of Philippi. So they were given an offer back.
Back to the earth.
Back to the earth, yes.
I just love the fact that these carvings are something that people put back into the earth in gratitude for them taking the rocks out of the earth to build this fantastic city of Philippi.
Giving back to the earth for what had been removed was a basic pagan belief. It was clearly well ingrained in this city. Convincing people to give up these traditions would not be easy. Paul's first challenge was to try and find a way into this possibly hostile community. He would have to tread carefully. What would become the Christian faith had never been spoken of in Europe before. He needed to find a sympathetic first audience.
When Paul first came here, he was just outside the Roman colony of Philippi. And, as was his custom, he went looking for a synagogue to start preaching. But the Jewish community here was so small, there wasn't even a synagogue. So he came down to a riverside, and there were a group of women here. One of the women was called Lydia, and she was a purple dye trader. And she heard him speak and was baptized. And the important thing here is that Lydia became the first European convert to this new religion that would one day be called Christianity.
Other converts followed. Paul now had a toehold in Europe, but his time in Philippi was short-lived. When he converted a slave girl without her owner's permission, it led to his arrest and public beating. Philippi was a start, but it was time to move on. Along the Via Ignatia to Thessalonica, 150 kilometers and a 4-day walk away. Though Paul was leaving Philippi behind, it was vitally important that he stayed in touch with the small community he had established. There was always the risk that a fledgling church would break apart after he had gone. Paul was to become a master of the new technology of letter writing. The only contemporary sources we have for Paul's life and journeys are in the Bible's book of Acts and in a remarkable series of his own letters which now form much of the New Testament. Each of these surviving letters was written to a specific community: the Philippians, the Romans, the Thessalonians. What intrigued me was how and why these letters were written. At Thessalonica's Vlatadon Monastery, I met biblical scholar Eddie Adams.
Paul primarily wrote to communities, and mostly to communities that he himself founded. So he was writing to his own converts. I think what prompts him to start writing is usually the circumstances of the churches being addressed. Something goes wrong, there's some problem, and that causes him to put pen to paper. I think he had a very strong sense of responsibility for the churches under his control. And I think his activity was absolutely frenetic. If he's not writing letters, he's going to new places to found congregations. We get the sense that Paul is, in every sense of the phrase, a man on a mission. Something to remember about the letters, which might interest you as an actor, David, is that they were written and they were designed to be read out loud in congregations and in community context.
So we actually have his spoken word.
Yes, I do think we are capturing the voice. We have, in the letters, captured the voice of Paul.
Inside the monastery, one of the monks had a surprise for us.
Hello.
Welcome.
So, where are we? What is...
So, this is the oldest part of Vlatadon Monastery, where the tradition says that here preached for the first time St. Paul to the people of Thessalonica.
Wow. He actually preached here?
Right in this
This is the
place.
spot.
This spot? That's amazing.
This mosaic is from 7th century. After that, in 14th century, they built the rest of the church.
Doesn't that put shivers up your back? This chapel was erected
Yes.
because Paul actually spoke here.
Yes.
I mean, that is quite extraordinary.
It gives you a kind of material connection.
Didn't expect that.
No, that was an unexpected pleasure.
So how did he actually write his letters then?
He's usually not the person who picks up the stylus and actually writes. Usually his letters are dictated. That seems to be his standard procedure for composing a letter.
Paul's letters were written to specific churches, but crucially, they were also copied and shared between communities, carrying his message and voice around the Roman world.
So, would you put this down for me?
Yes, of course.
There is neither Jew nor Gentile. Neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Can you read that back to me now in Greek?
Yes. Ουκ ένι Ιουδαίος ουδέ Έλλην, ουκ ένι δούλος ουδέ ελεύθερος. Ουκ ένι άνσερ και φίλοι πάντας και γάρι μην εισήστε εν Χριστώ Ιησού.
And that actually is a quote from one of Paul's letters. And that is how he actually wrote them. He didn't pick up a quill, dip it in ink and write on a piece of paper or papyrus. No, he dictated them to a scribe. So what we have when we actually read Paul's letters are his actual spoken words, his chosen vocabulary, his sweep of sentences, his energy. And that tells me so much about Paul the man. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Steus.
You're welcome.
In recent years, some of Paul's letters have come under fire. One passage in particular has been drawn into the modern debate over women's place in the church and has been used to justify why they shouldn't be priests. Women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. Yet in the very same letter, Paul appears to contradict himself by referring to women praying and prophesying in church, implying he doesn't expect them to be silent. Remember, Paul's first convert in Europe had been a woman. In another letter, he mentions 26 prominent members of the community, 9 of whom are women. Women were also valuable recruits. Being in charge of the household meant they could offer a venue for meetings and access to networks of family, friends, and associates. So was Paul a misogynist? How should we read his letters? The next day, in Thessalonica's central market, I met New Testament scholar Ekaterini Zalampuni.
Do you think Paul would have attracted women to follow him?
Paul had many co-workers who were women. Well, Paul, of course, he's a man of his word. He knows very well what the place of women in this society is. He, of course, takes into consideration these ideas, but I think he's a little bit progressive. He treats them somehow as equals.
I really find that so fascinating. So is what you're actually saying is that the seeds of women's liberation today could have been sown in Paul's own theology?
Yes, because for Paul, always we must connect his thought, his theological ideas, with his expectation of this end of the world. He's quite sure that the end is imminent.
Yes.
So he thinks and sees everything through this perspective. And when you see things this way, so you can see that men and women can only be equal.
There is neither male nor female.
So, yes. No,
it's brilliant.
Greek,
I've never read it that way before. Thank you.
Ekaterini's point was simple. Paul was a man of his time with the attitudes of his time. But he also believed the end of the world was coming soon. He didn't differentiate between men and women. His goal was to save as many people as possible, and no one should be lost. In Thessalonica, though, Paul's drive for new converts provoked an angry mob. Some in the city took his claims that Jesus was a king and that there was only one God as a direct challenge to the authority of Caesar. Around AD 49, he wrote his letter to the Thessalonians, the earliest surviving Christian writing of any kind. In it, it's clear that he'd left behind a small but thriving community. The legacy continues to this day. After being driven out of Thessalonica, Paul set off for Athens. To aid his journeys and the transport of his letters, he was able to exploit the supremely efficient communications network of the Roman Empire.
I suppose roads like these would have been called the superhighways of the ancient world. They would have carried messages, information, and new ideas between cities, towns, and villages. But unlike the modern high-speed internet, where messages can travel across the globe in seconds, in the ancient world, messages traveled slowly and would have required someone to actually set out on a journey.
I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country. Paul knew the risks, but he wouldn't give up. For me, the journey to Athens was by car and train. Paul would have walked or traveled by ship along the Aegean coast. On a clear day, he could have seen Mount Olympus, home of the Greek gods.
Who are they? The 12 gods of Olympus?
Ares.
Ares?
Yeah. Theas.
Theas?
Poseidonas.
Poseidoras?
Poseidonas. Not.
Poseidonas?
Yeah.
Yes.
Ira.
Ira. We got 4. We've got 8 more to go. You got 15 kilometers to find 8 gods. I'm getting quite excited now because there are one or two characteristics of Paul that are rising to the surface that are really changing my preconceptions about him. For example, I've been told by now so many people that Paul appears to be pro-women, whereas before I thought he was completely anti-women, almost a misogynist. Another thing is his persistence. He goes into these pagan cultures and everything seems to start off quite well and then it goes totally pear-shaped, and this repeats itself over and over again, apart from perhaps from Thessaloniki, which seems to have had some success. And now I'm off to Athens, the center of philosophy and learning. I wonder how he fared there.
When Paul arrived in Athens, it had been under Roman rule for more than 100 years. Yet it was still the cultural and intellectual center of the ancient world. A place of lively debate pretty much all of the time. Convincing a city of master philosophers that they should give up their pagan beliefs would be a hard sell indeed. According to tradition, Paul confronted the philosophers on the Areopagus, a bare marble hill below the Acropolis in Athens. It was there I met historian Despina Iosif.
Despina, we're in this fantastic location, but how does this relate to Paul?
It's a place where Athenians used to hold philosophical discussions, and it's no wonder because it had this amazing view, as you can see. When Paul came to Athens and he was preaching the Christian message, some philosophers found his message intriguing and they decided to bring him here, and they invited him to give a speech.
What do you think Paul's reaction would have been coming to Athens?
He saw the city full of gods and so many idols everywhere and so many temples. He was in fact outraged to see the city full of pagan gods.
Athenians typically worship their gods with offerings or animal sacrifices at altars scattered around the city. In his speech, Paul mentioned seeing an altar honoring an unknown god.
The Athenians venerated the unknown god just to make sure that they didn't leave.
Didn't leave anybody out.
Exactly.
Yeah, you've got to hedge your bets when gods are concerned.
Exactly, you can never be too sure.
No.
Referring to the unknown god allowed Paul to argue that his God was now making himself known to Athens.
Was his message shocking to them?
Oh, I'm sure it was, because they were really unfamiliar with the Jewish religion. And he told them about the coming of Jesus and the resurrection of the dead, which they really found particularly odd. To the Greco-Roman mind, humans had an agreement of a reciprocal nature with their gods. Gods expected humans to perform sacrifices for them, and humans expected in return gods to grant them prosperity and to fulfill their wishes. So the Christian message must have struck, at least initially, most pagan listeners as bizarre.
I wonder what it must have been like for Paul in Athens, convinced that he, among all others, was the only one who knew that the world was about to end. Did he ever have doubts? Did he ever worry how he was perceived? At the city's agora, the ancient marketplace, I met archaeologist Heinrich Hall.
So if Athens was such a mega center of paganism, why would he have bothered?
I think he had to come here, really. I think not coming to Athens for his mission would simply not have done, because Athens is such a significant intellectual center and a center of debate, as we said. So for someone who comes to spread a new idea, avoiding Athens would look very odd and a bit weak.
So what was the reaction to Paul?
It's not terribly clear, I think. If you read the account in the Acts, the reaction seems to be not disrespectful. They don't cause him trouble, they don't arrest him, there's no fighting. It also doesn't seem overly respectful. They don't mass convert or anything like that.
Paul faced an uphill challenge to convince Athenians of his message. Philosophical debate was woven through the very fabric of the city, and I'd heard about the ancient Greek tradition of symposiums. Basically, a drinking party with added philosophy. Restaurateur Souli Adamis had researched the food and culture of the symposium to bring the tradition back to life for modern Greeks.
First, the men have to be addressed, and then the women. Okay.
I was asked to give a helping hand preparing a typical symposium meal.
Souli, what are we actually going to be cooking?
Today we're going to cook piglet, a stuffed piglet.
Stuffed piglet. Now, is this a traditional dish?
This is from the 5th century before Christ. They had this during symposium. Of course, everybody uses this word, but in Greek means that I share with my friends, eating, drinking, and sharing our ideas, exchanging our philosophical ideas. And these symposiums would last around 12 hours.
12 hours?
12 hours.
The symposium tradition caused Paul considerable problems. Taking bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus at the Last Supper was an important part of early Christian worship. But from his letters, it's clear some of Paul's Greek converts didn't understand the difference between the Christian celebration and the festivals of eating and drinking that they had become used to at symposiums. Your meetings do more harm than good. It is not the Lord's Supper you eat, for when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in?
It's my friend.
This is your friend. This is your friend. Okay, what now? What do we do?
You will stuff pink.
Okay. My goodness. I feel like a surgeon now.
Oh, yes.
And this now goes in the oven. How long do you cook this?
6 hours.
6 hours?
Yes.
6 hours, gas mark 4. It's going to be fantastic. It's been absolutely fascinating for me to watch this reenactment of a symposium. And this was going on when Paul would have been here. And you can see how the debating, the intellectual society was really rooted in Athens. But apparently this could become very bawdy indeed. I think I'll leave them to it. Could go on for some time.
Paul had little success with the Athens intellectual elite. He needed a city with a more receptive audience, somewhere it would be easier to convince people of the value of his arguments. And so to Corinth, and through the magnificent Corinth Canal. Completed in 1893, amazingly the first serious attempt to construct it was started in Paul's day. The Emperor Nero himself digging out the first rock with a golden pick.
This is extraordinary. We must appear that size from up there. What a feat of engineering. I wonder what Paul was thinking as he approached Corinth. I mean, he had a pretty tough time of it in Europe so far, and yes, he'd made a few converts along the way, but certainly in Thessaloniki and Philippi, he had to leave in a hurry, and he wasn't that well received in Athens. So it must have been with a little more than apprehension that he was approaching possibly the most notorious city in Greece. As he himself says in a letter, "I came to you in weakness and fear and much trembling." At that time, Corinth was literally a melting pot of people from different nations, different religions, and certainly different morals, so it must have been a huge challenge ahead of Paul.
When Paul first arrived in Corinth around AD 50, this was a young and dynamic city with attitudes to match. Unlike Athens, It had been rebuilt as a Roman colony less than 100 years earlier. Free of religious and intellectual traditions, Paul had more room to operate. According to Acts, he set up shop and started earning a living as a tent maker. Archaeologist Guy Sanders, excavation director here for the last 15 years, agreed to show me around. Guy, this looks like a major street or road. What's around it?
It's the major road of the city. It's the Cardo Maximus. It's the main north-south drag in the city of Corinth.
So where we're walking now, Paul would have walked?
Oh, many times, I would have thought, yes.
And would he have had a shop here in these colonnades?
I think this was a high rent for Paul. It's more like Harrods than the kind of place that you would find a tent maker's shop.
Yeah.
He would have been a few streets over, I think.
Why would Paul have come here then? What was special about Corinth?
Well, it was one of the biggest cities in the empire. It had fantastic harbour facilities on both coasts. So there would have been hundreds of thousands of people living in the region and engaged in international trade.
Yes.
So people may have come from as far away as Britain and Egypt and
Really?
the Black Sea.
Britain here?
I think highly likely you had people from the northwest of Europe as well as from the farthest flung parts of the empire. And by coming here, Paul had a captive audience, and when they left again, they would be perhaps taking his message far further than he could carry it.
Did he have a strategy, do you think, in coming here? Or?
He stayed in Corinth for about 18 months,
Yes.
Which I think suggests that he did have a strategy, and he'd invested a lot of money and effort in trying to establish his church in Corinth. He had to support himself somehow, and he was a tent maker, as you said. And the kind of society that he moved in was probably the poorer echelons of society. We're talking about 8 in 10 people would have been at the poverty line. But I imagine that he had a lot of contacts with people within his peer group. There's no reason why he wouldn't be sitting outside a shop making his tents, and so that he could talk to people who are passing by on the streets. And some people he'd meet once, and many people would come back and talk again.
What I've learned about Paul, now having visited Athens and Corinth, is that he was very adaptable. He was also a man who knew when he was wanted and when he wasn't. I mean, we learned that in Athens he could talk to philosophers, but he wasn't really welcome there and he left, whereas in Corinth it was a different matter. He seemed to get on more with the common people. This was a port, a great port city. People would come in from all over the world and go out to other parts of the world. He must have felt happier here because he stayed here for 18 months, longer than, well, anywhere else he stayed. So that in his own words, I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means, I might save some.
While in Corinth, Paul wrote a letter to a community of believers in Rome. It laid out his theology in the clearest possible terms. Romans would become the most influential script in the history of Christian thought. His purpose for writing it was to announce his intention of visiting the city to gather funds for a mission westwards, perhaps to Spain. But before he could go, he had an errand to run, back to Jerusalem.
We know that Paul made at least 2 trips to Corinth. And when he was leaving for the final time, he was taking with him quite a large sum of money as a donation for the church back at Jerusalem. It would appear that his plan was to set sail from a nearby port, here at Kenkre. But at the very last minute, he and his companions discovered a plot against Paul's life. So he decided to walk clockwise around the Aegean. I think this is clockwise.
Returning to Jerusalem proved to be a fateful decision. Trouble was brewing. Many Jews believed Paul's methods in converting pagans were anti-Jewish and were baying for blood. A showdown was coming at the Jewish temple, the most sacred site in Judaism. Archaeologist Ronnie Reich has directed the excavations on the temple steps where Paul and indeed Jesus would once have walked.
We are outside the Temple Mount. We just climbed the main staircase leading to one of two gates, the Hulda gates. And you should imagine masses of people in those days coming on pilgrimage to enter the Temple Mount, bringing their offerings, animals, sheep, to be slaughtered there in front of the temple on the altar of sacrifice.
How many people would have come in the first century?
Tens of thousands.
Did they have any ritual to go through before they would enter?
Oh, certainly. One obligatory ritual, everybody had to be in a pure state, ritually pure.
Yeah.
That means that he had to take a ritual bath in what is called in Hebrew a mikveh.
There are many mikvahs?
Yes, yes. Let's have a look.
Okay, show me one.
Yes, here, there. Here. Use the steps into the mikveh. You have to imagine that it was full with water.
Right up to about here?
Up to about here. A total immersion of the human body for one moment, just into the water and outside from the water, makes you pure.
And it was so important.
Well, this was a prerequisite entering the Temple Mount. You don't go to the temple as a tourist, just to have a look and enjoy.
No.
You go for the rituals and prayers and to see the house of God. And now we are pure. We can go to the temple.
When Paul returned to Jerusalem, it would have been natural for him to visit the temple. The strict purity rules meant that any non-Jewish or Gentile companions he had with him were not allowed beyond a certain point. Paul knew these rules, but he was accused of breaking them. Either he purposely picked a fight, or his enemies had framed him. We're told that within moments a riot broke out. Paul's life was in grave danger. Could he really have provoked such a violent response? The temple, Paul knew, was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, around 10 years after his visit. In the 7th century, the Dome of the Rock, one of the most sacred places in Islam, was built on the site. Gershon Solomon, founder of the Temple Faithful movement, is leading a highly controversial campaign to rebuild a third Jewish temple in its place. He fervently believes a biblical temple should once again be at the center of Jewish life, and he would reinstate the ancient traditions. But I was hoping Gershon could help me understand why Paul's alleged actions were so provocative.
The temple was the heart and the soul of the Jewish people. They could not come inside the temple because of the law of pureness. You should know it is not, you are not coming in a regular building.
No.
Even not to a synagogue, you are coming to the house of God.
If it was discovered that Paul brought Gentiles inside this temple area, how would people have reacted then?
First of all, it would be considered as a terrible provocation.
Yes.
And he knew the law of the temple.
And he would have known.
Yeah.
Yes.
On the wall was written in Greek that a stranger that will cross this wall will die.
Will die?
Will die, yeah. So if Paul or any other one will bring Gentiles inside the temple, it could be a terrible thing, and the reaction will be also terribly.
Which is why there was a riot.
Yeah.
In the end, only the intervention of the nearby Roman garrison saved Paul's life. He was arrested and taken under military escort to the Roman governor in Caesarea. Paul's mission had come to a grinding halt. Caesarea was the capital of the Roman province of Judea, purpose-built around a magnificent new harbor. Roman historian Gil Gambash took me into the water to see its remains.
So, the big pillars there,
Yes, they are.
they're huge.
We could actually
touch them.
It comes all the way up to the surface.
Yes.
The columns themselves couldn't be earlier than Herodian, right? So we're talking about late 1st century BCE.
Nearly 2,000 years.
That's right, even more than that.
2,000 years.
Paul spent 2 years under arrest in Caesarea. Back on dry land, Gil showed me where it's thought he may have spent much of that time.
Caesarea would be very much like the mirror of Rome. The governor of this province would be sitting here in this most central city in Judea, probably making use of Herod's palace, where we stand right now, as his praetorium, his government's seat, if you will.
So where we're standing now, the praetorium, did you say? The praetorium. Would Paul have been imprisoned or put under house arrest here, where we are now?
It's very hard to tell, but there is a likelihood that, yes, this is the seat of the governor. But we have to imagine some sort of being held under the custody of the governor, not because he's guilty of something, but because there are charges standing open against him, and also, perhaps even more so, because he's a destabilizing element in the province.
Yes.
And I think that would have been a strong enough motivation for the governor to keep him close by.
The Roman governor seemed in no particular hurry to resolve Paul's case. But after 2 years, that governor was replaced. The new man was minded to send Paul back to Jerusalem. It would have meant certain death. Paul demanded his right as a Roman citizen to be tried in Rome. As he languished in prison, Paul seems to have begun reflecting. Ever since his conversion, he had been preaching that the end of days was coming soon. Our salvation is nearer now than we first believed. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. The trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. But the years had passed, and the world had not ended. Paul began to suspect that he himself might die before Jesus returned. From prison he wrote, "I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far."
It's very moving for me to think that it's here in Caesarea that Paul would have spent his last 2 years in the Holy Land. But he spent it under guard, fighting for his innocence and having to appeal to Caesar and go to Rome. And I wonder when he left here what he would have thought. Maybe he thought this was his last view of the Holy Land, and that's given me pause for reflection.
Many of Paul's ideas on how converts should live their lives challenged the social and political structures of the Roman state. If the world had ended as he predicted, none of this would have mattered. But as time went on and communities grew larger, it was inevitable that Paul's subversive message would be noticed. The world was changing, and these early Christians now risked the wrath of Rome. The very place where Paul was now heading. The Bible's book of Acts tells how Paul was taken by ship to Rome. But on the way, a storm blew up, and after 2 weeks of being tossed around at sea, he was shipwrecked on Malta. The ship's company was forced to overwinter on the island before continuing to Rome.
Paul finally arrived in Italy around AD 60. From the port of Puteoli, where he landed, it was then a 130-mile walk along this road, the Appian Way, to Rome. By now, he was probably in his late 50s and would have spent 30 years on the road. He had established small communities of believers throughout the Roman Empire, but this was his first time in the imperial city itself, and he was arriving in chains. It must surely have crossed his mind that he might never leave Rome alive.
The Rome Paul saw was not the Rome of Gladiator. Many of the big iconic monuments, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Triumphal Arches, had not yet been built. But the city was under the rule of the Emperor Nero, who would launch the first imperial persecution of the Christians. Back on the Appian Way, I met archaeologist Valerie Higgins.
Very, very nice to meet you. Paul coming to Rome, he would have come into a pagan society. How did the pagans regard Christians?
Christians were quite threatening because, of course, the pagan religion was not a religion in the sense that we know religion, in that it was not divorced from the state. And indeed, the state was intimately involved in the religion.
I see.
So you're really talking, if you're saying that he denies the pagan gods, it's really treason, because it's really denying the emperor and his power. It may seem to us that Christians wouldn't be that threatening. You know,
No.
what is it in the message that's so threatening? But it is that denial of the emperor, denial of the gods.
I suppose we're so used to Christianity today, we have no idea that it could have ever been that sort of a threat at all.
Well, in a way, it seems bizarre that an empire like the Roman Empire, which has all these armies and has all this power, seems to feel so threatened by a message which is actually so mild in many ways, you know, but they really genuinely did feel threatened by it.
Rome was not a good place to argue that there was only one God, and that God wasn't Caesar. In his search for a fair trial, Paul had insisted on his right as a Roman citizen to be tried in Rome. It may have been a fatal mistake.
After his arrival here in Rome, the story of Paul then gets a little hazy. From the book of Acts in the Bible, we know that he was allowed to stay in rented accommodation for 2 years, but a soldier was guarding him. He was, however, allowed to welcome visitors. After that, the story just simply stops. There's no record of his trial, well, let alone any results of it. So what was actually going on?
Tradition claims that Paul lived in Rome's Jewish quarter. Of course, he'd supposedly come here to stand trial for violating the temple in Jerusalem. But after 2 years, maybe that offense had been forgotten. Curiously, though he was under some form of house arrest, he does seem to have been free to carry on trying to make new converts. A dangerous game under Nero. The church tradition is that Paul paid the ultimate price and was martyred for his faith. Father Scott Broder, an expert in Paul's writings, explained what he thinks may have happened.
He is announcing that Jesus is Lord. And we know in the Roman Empire there's only one Lord, and he is Caesar. So if someone starts saying, this Jesus, this Jew from Galilee, we believe he is the Son of God, and he continues to reign, he has power. Are you implying that his power is conflicting with that of Caesar? Yes. Wow.
Oh, that's political.
That's very political indeed. And he's brought before the authorities for this political charge. He's not going to back down. He's not going to suddenly change his tune and say, this isn't what I believe. Of course it is. And ultimately, that's what gets him killed.
How was he executed?
He was beheaded. He was beheaded. So, compared to crucifixion, a far more merciful way to put someone to death. A quicker way. Horrific in itself, of course, but again, compared to crucifixion, far less painful.
There's something that slightly puzzles me. It's such a major event in Christianity. Why isn't it mentioned?
We have to remember that the Acts of the Apostles are written by St. Luke. And St. Luke has other concerns. It is not a biography. So Luke is concerned with showing that the gospel has reached Rome and it continues to be preached.
So, in a sense, what you're saying is he deliberately didn't write it, because if you write the death of Paul, people could be reading that's the death of the gospel.
Precisely. That's the point.
Some have argued that Paul wasn't executed, that he continued westward to Spain or perhaps returned to the east. The truth is, we just don't know. But the church tradition is that he was beheaded and buried here in Rome, where the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls now stands.
Good evening, Your Eminence.
Cardinal Francesco Monterisi led me to what he believes is the final resting place of Paul.
The tomb is behind this door.
And inside the sarcophagus is St. Paul?
Yes, we believe the body of St. Paul is inside.
Have you been able to see inside?
We could not open the sarcophagus, but an endoscope has been dropped inside.
Yes.
We were able to see some pieces of tissue and some pieces of bones. We were able to take a small piece of bone, and it was examined by experts. The result of the examination was that it belonged to a man of the 1st or 2nd century after Christ.
Right. How amazing.
This is the basis of our idea that this is the real core of St. Paul buried in this sarcophagus.
Amazing. It's very special.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much.
It is a great pleasure.
It's a great privilege for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can never be sure whether Paul's body ever lay in this tomb. It seems that the biggest piece of evidence that he died in Rome is that it is here that his story ends. There is simply no evidence for anything else.
It's strange that the New Testament doesn't record what happened to Paul. If he was executed, then perhaps publicizing that fact would only serve to discourage new converts. Or maybe in the midst of Nero's persecution of Christians, one man's death simply went unnoticed. The Roman persecution of Christians, however, continued for 2.5 centuries after Paul's death, but the faith continued to grow until AD 380, when Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Rome seemed to have no record of Paul, but it did hold one incredible last clue to the man I thought I had come to know. Throughout my journey, I'd carried in my imagination a portrait of Paul, an image I'd seen repeated in paintings, statues, and icons down through the centuries. And then, in a suburb of Rome, in a catacomb deep beneath a modern office block, my guide Dario took me to meet archaeologist Fabrizio Visconti. He had made an astounding discovery.
Oh, goodness, look.
Professor Visconti, buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
David Suchet, il nostro conduttore, Professor Visconti.
Professor Visconti, hello.
Ok, andiamo.
Oh,
grazie.
Thank you.
These catacombs were originally pagan, but began to be used by Rome's Christians in the 4th century AD. What I was about to learn about the man I had been pursuing for so long would come as a bit of a shock.
E adesso le faccio vedere l'immagine di San Paolo che abbiamo scoperto con questi restauri. Ecco, è proprio qui nel soffitto, in questo punto, vede?
Oh my goodness me, there he is.
Con l'immagine di Paolo, ecco, si vede molto bene la fisionomia, si riconosce l'occhio e la barba a punta tipica dell'immagine di Paolo. La calvizie, cioè qui è un po' pelato, diciamo, senza capelli, e poi la tunica bianca tipica dell'immagine di Paolo.
He's got very piercing eyes.
Ah, l'occhio è un occhio spirituale, È proprio l'occhio puntato che guarda in un punto lontano, indefinito, come alla ricerca della verità.
That's unique, isn't it? And the date of this?
La data di questo, professore?
Noi lo possiamo datare alla fine del IV secolo, tra il 380 e il 390.
380
Yes.
AD. So is this the very earliest picture of Paul in the world?
Questo è l'immagine in busto, in clipeo, più antico che abbiamo trovato nell'arte cristiana.
It was so exciting to see the earliest ever portrait of Paul. He was exactly as I had always imagined him. But it appeared that this was not in fact Paul.
Do you think that is what Paul looked like?
No, sicuramente Paolo non era così. È un ritratto inventato, di invenzione naturalmente, e di ispirazione all'immagine filosofica, che era più vicino cronologicamente e idealmente alla figura di San Paolo. Ecco che chi ha concepito l'immagine di Paolo si ispira a quella di Plotino, che era un'immagine forse non proprio verosimigliante, ma molto vicino a Plotino.
After all this time, Paul was not Paul. His portrait had been based on the image of a 3rd century philosopher called Plotinus. That image had then been copied down through the centuries. So maybe he didn't look like me after all. In a strange sort of way, it was appropriate that if I really wanted to find Paul, the best place to look was in his own words.
So let's hear this extraordinary man speak. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. How can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. Like Paul or dislike him, you certainly can't ignore him.